Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. On today's episode, my guest is Jim Tracy, an award-winning journalist who grew up in the Adirondacks and had a indirect personal encounter with a notorious serial killer from the 1970s, Robert Garrow, and went on to write a book about the investigation, capture, trial, and legal wranglings involving this case, some of which are taught in law schools today. And I'm still literally on the edge of my seat from this story. And I know I'm not going to say anything more about it. The book is called Sworn to Silence: The Truth Behind Robert Garrow and the Missing Bodies Case. I don't want to give any of the details away in this introduction. It is our first episode dealing with issues of true crime, issues of a notorious serial killer, and the twists and turns. Oh my gosh, you just have to listen to this episode. I know you're going to find it as fascinating as I did. There'll be a link so that you can order a copy of the book if you're as moved as I am to do so. Stay tuned for this exciting episode of Good Law, Bad Law. I want to welcome my guest on today's episode, Jim Tracy. Jim is a journalist and now the author of a really special book, and one that he has also a personal connection to, which we're going to get into. The story is called Sworn to Silence: The Truth Behind Robert Garrow and the Missing Bodies Case. Jim, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law.
Oh, thank you for having me.
This is actually, I believe it's the first episode we've ever done on anything to do with serial killers. So I've been really excited to talk with you, and what an incredible story. Maybe we could start, Jim, just give us a little background on yourself professionally, your writing background, and then let's get into the varying ways that you and the story of this serial killer and the really challenging issue for any lawyer and anyone interested in law and lawyering, this incredibly challenging issue of attorney-client privilege and how that is so central to the story. Like, first, give us some background on yourself.
Sure. I grew up in the foothills of the Adirondacks in upstate New York, and started a journalism career around 1990 and had quite a bit of success. And one of the stories I wrote was a 6-day series on this case that became quite a sensation. I won several awards, and I decided to turn it into a book. So after a 10-year journalism career, I started working on the book and working part-time at other things, and I've completed the book. I had grown up when this case happened. I was 8 years old, but my father hunted in that area, so I knew the area. I had been there just as a kid.
You mean the area where this serial killer?
Yeah, the area where this serial killer was.
Mm-hmm.
So anyways, the book is completed and out for publication.
Well, and as I understand it, the background here, this guy, Garrow, Robert Garrow, this was a series of killings that took place in the 1970s in the area where your dad had a hunting lodge. Give us some of the background on the crimes themselves and how this was in this part of the country, in this part of New York State, such a sensation and such a scary time.
Okay, so what happened is in the southern Adirondacks, there was a man found murdered, and his girlfriend was missing. And we hadn't had that type of crime up here in the Adirondacks. And the fact that this young couple, Danny Porter and Sue Petz, they were quite successful already, even though they were 23 and 21 respectively. Danny Porter, in the summer of 1973, when this occurred, he had just finished working for George McGovern's presidential campaign in a major role. And Sue Petz was a Boston University journalism major, one semester away from graduating. So anyways, this boy's murdered. Police find this boy murdered, and the girl's missing. So we have this case here, and police have no clues. All they have is a locked car and a missing woman in a body. Lo and behold, 2 weeks later, on Sunday, July 29th, 1973, on a quiet Sunday morning, 4 campers nearby are captured, tied. One boy is murdered, an 18-year-old camper, and the other 3 escape, and the killer flees into the woods. Manhunt begins in the Adirondacks. And they identify the suspect as Robert Garrow. He's an ex-convict. He's from the Adirondacks, but he currently lives in Syracuse. And police suspect that he knows where, that he has the missing woman with him.
Oh.
Because the two murders that were 2 weeks apart were exactly the same. And also he was after a woman in the party of 4 when he murdered the boy. Luckily, they escaped.
What about the murders was similar enough that the police thought they were connected?
Both victims were tied to trees in swampy areas and stabbed in the chest with the same size knife.
Okay.
But so anyways, this manhunt commences in the Adirondacks, and for people who don't know, the Adirondack Mountains is massive. It's 6 million acres. It makes up 1/5 of New York State. It's one of the wildest parts of the Eastern Seaboard. So they're hunting for this Garrow, who the public learns is a very big man, a strong man. He's a woodsman, and he's armed and dangerous. And this is at the height of the tourist season in the Adirondacks. So this pretty much shuts down the tourist season.
Wow.
What the public doesn't know is that police want to spare his life because they're convinced he has a woman with him, the girlfriend of the first missing victim.
Are police at this point, Jim, also thinking there could be other killings associated with the same person?
Yes, as the manhunt goes on, they're receiving, at the time, which was the pre-fax era, they're receiving teletypes about other crimes that fit this man's description and other rapes. So they are desperate to capture this guy, and they make a conscious decision to spare his life, and because they want to question him.
Right. They want to catch him alive.
They want to catch him alive.
Right.
And,
okay.
There's strict orders to catch him alive.
Mm-hmm.
And anyways, he's at the time, there were roadblocks everywhere in the area. There was just a dark cloud over the whole area. Nobody knew where this guy was. Everybody speculated that, he was here and there. There were spottings everywhere in a 50-mile radius. They all had to be checked out. None proved to be him. And, no matter how many times you went through a roadblock, your car had to be searched completely. And it was just a terrible, terrible time. People locked their doors for the first time, loaded weapons. Police knew people were carrying weapons, but they let it go because of the situation. And it really, really frightened people terribly.
Well, and you told us how vast an area the Adirondacks is. So there's a lot of places for him to hide during this manhunt. Not only did you grow up in that time in that area, and you said your dad had a place he liked to go to hunt in the Adirondacks, but as it turns out, among the places that Garrow hid out during the manhunt, directly crossed paths with your family. That's just an incredible connection you have to this story. Tell us about that and kind of when you pieced that together as part of the story.
Yeah, my father received a call one night during this manhunt, and you know, I was a little bit of a precocious kid. I was aware, even though I was 8 years old, I was aware of what was going on, and he never received. It was rare for him to receive a call at home. He did most of his socializing outside. So, anyways, we learned that Garrow had broke into the camp and stole clothes and ate food and had departed. So he had broken into a lot of camps, but a lot of the land is leased, and it was hard to find all the camp owners, but they did locate us. They had proof that he was in there. They had a boot print where he had gone in above the door through the window above the door.
Okay.
He had stolen clothes from the camp. So we went to the camp, and while he was on the loose, and saw where he had. I saw his big boot print on a white card table he placed in front of the door.
Wow.
And so, anyways, at the time we went there, you know, I didn't know it, but my father knew he had stolen a car and left the area. So even though he was loose, he wasn't in the immediate area of the hunting lodge. So it was safe for us to go. But of course, you know, something like that when you're 8 years old, you know, it's indelibly marked in your brain to see that, you know, he was known as the boogeyman of the Adirondacks, and to see his big boot print on that table, you know, it was quite a thing, frightening.
Wow.
And anyways, from what I pieced together, that day that we saw that boot print was the day he was captured about an hour north.
Oh.
He was wounded by a forest ranger, shot in the foot. And really, this is where the story starts, is police now have him in custody. And in the book, you know, the detective is a unique character. His name's Henry McCabe, and he's the main investigator throughout the case. And of course, they interrogate Garrow. They bring him. He was shot in a place called Mineville, which is on Lake Champlain in northern New York. And they take him to a hospital in Plattsburgh, near the Canadian border. That's the closest place. And they interrogate him about this missing woman and other possible missing women, and they can't get anything out of him. He'll talk about any subject but the subject they're interested in. Mm-hmm. And terribly frustrated, they try every tactic to get him to elicit a confession, and they can't break him. And meanwhile, the pressure's building because the parents want to know, you know, what this guy knows about their missing daughter.
Right.
And so anyways, there's a lawyer in Syracuse named Frank Armony, and he has represented Robert Garrow in the past. So he's very excited about this. He's a civil lawyer, and he's worked a couple criminal cases with Garrow, some minor stuff in Syracuse. And, you know, this is the biggest case of his life. You know, his client is being hunted by, you know, half the state of New York. This at the time was the largest and costliest manhunt in state history. And could be argued it still is. And
I mean, as a civil lawyer, Jim, it's a little hard for me to imagine actually getting excited about a case like this. But as a criminal defense lawyer, or if you are a lawyer who does some of that work, I can see this must have been. You can see how this would be the biggest case. Was this a young guy, Frank Armony?
No, he was in his 40s, mid 40s at the time, 43, and he was very successful. He was Italian. He grew up in Solvay in central New York. It was a heavy Italian thing. His parents were immigrants, and you know, he was kind of the picture of the American dream. He went to Syracuse University, got a bachelor's degree, graduated from law school, went into law practice, had a very successful civil practice, was married, owned a home locally, had two teenage daughters. And he seemed to be, and I go into this in the book, he seemed to be looking for something new, like maybe a midlife crisis. He accomplished everything he had wanted to do, yet he was only 44 years old. So, and he self-admittedly admitted, he's still alive today. He admitted that, you know, he was excited about this case, you know, And he went on television several times, which he was criticized for grandstanding during the manhunt, asking for his client to turn himself in. And he had done a little bit of criminal law, but he was a liability lawyer. And but he put himself up front as this Robert Garrow's lawyer, and he represented him, and he wanted him to turn himself in. And so anyways, lo and behold, the man's captured, police can't break him, and Armani goes and sees him in the hospital. And of course, Garrow won't tell him anything either. He knows innately, he knows not to, the secrets he has, he does not want to tell anyone. And Armani's feeling overwhelmed. You know, it's him against the world. The state police are there. They place him in a room on the 5th floor, which was empty at the time. It used to be a psychiatric ward. So the room that Mr. Garrow was in was partitioned with glass. So police were observing him 24/7.
Okay.
They were trying to break him, trying to intimidate him, trying to listen in on him. You know, desperate to find the location of this missing Boston University woman and possibly others. And so Armani elicits the help of his good friend, who is a criminal trial lawyer, one of the best in Central New York, a man named Frank Belge. And Belge's a brilliant lawyer. He had defended some big cases in the past, and you know, it was very good reputation. He's the same age as Armani.
Okay.
And Belge wants nothing to do with it. He knows this case is a no-win battle. There's 3 eyewitnesses to the murder, the fact that Garrow fled, the animosity of the people in the Adirondacks for ruining their tourist season. He wants nothing to do with this. But Armani can't do this alone. He knows that he is not qualified to handle something like this.
Too big for him. He's excited about it, but it really sounds like it's too big for him.
It's too big for him when he starts to get into it. And I think he needs moral support too. Even if he can handle intellectually and legally, he just doesn't want to do it alone. So he begs Belge to help him. And Belge goes to the hospital with him, and there's a confrontation between Belge and state police because Armani's the only one with permission to go in and see Garrow. And Belge's kind of a big, hefty guy and kind of flamboyant and boisterous. And the troopers put their hands on him, and he gets into a wrestling match with the troopers.
Oh, boy.
They pin him against the wall, and he declares he's on the case now. He tells Frank, I'm on the case now, you know, because of this incident. And
he got pushed into it by the police.
Yeah, literally.
Yeah.
And so anyways, he begins this case on that note.
Okay.
Which is not a good way to begin because he wanted nothing to do with it. He had only went to the hospital to placate Armani because Armani was begging him to please come. And he also wanted to meet Garrow. So anyways, they don't get anywhere with the questioning. Garrow knows better than to tell anyone what he knows.
Right.
And you know, it's no secret. Garrow, eventually we learn, is a serial killer. They've been doing this quite a while, keep capturing. He was a serial rapist, targeting couples mainly. He would kill the boy or chase the boy off and rape the girl. A lot of the girls lived if they didn't fight, but others died when they fought. He would lose temper. And then towards the end, when he got to the Adirondacks, he decided he was leaving no witnesses. And that's when he started, you know, killing everybody. So anyway, so they get nowhere with Garrow in their questioning. So Armani, in desperation, because Belge's telling Armani he's not going to take the case because Garrow won't help. They want to know all the facts behind the one murder that he's been arrested for, the 18-year-old camper, the second murder. And Armani decides to hypnotize him.
Oh.
It was a trick he had learned more as a party trick, and he became pretty good at it, but he never used it legally because of the ramifications, the legality of it and everything. But he was so desperate that Belge was going to quit that he asked Garrow if he would go under hypnotism. And it's all been confirmed. You know, Garrow later sued him for hypnotizing him. Oh. But anyways, he hypnotized him, and he told Garrow to talk to Belge in the morning And Armani didn't tell Belgi about the hypnotism because of the ramifications. But he said, I think that I've convinced Garrow to talk to you. So anyways, Belgi goes in and Garrow pours his soul out to him. Belgi doesn't know he's hypnotized, but he tells of likely many murders. They said it was only 4, but I uncovered that it was more.
When you say they say, you mean the two Franks,
The two attorneys
lawyers say that
they've always stuck to the thing that Garrow told them of 4. Although I have later disclosure from Armani saying it was a lot more.
Oh wow!
But when they went public, they said he had admitted 4 murders, and it was the 4 that police were most suspicious of, that had the most evidence of. And but the most important thing was he told them what state police were desperate for. Where were the location of 2 women, a 16-year-old girl in Syracuse and Sue Petz, who was killed in the Adirondacks, the Boston journalism major.
Well, where you left us was that she was missing, and
she was missing, and they suspected he had her stashed somewhere.
Yeah.
And Garrow admitted, no, he killed her.
Okay.
He camped with her for 3 days and then killed her. And he hid her in a mine shaft behind his parents' house in Mineville. And he hid the other girl in a cemetery behind his own home in Syracuse. And the lawyers weren't sure. They weren't sure if the veracity of his story, because they thought maybe he was trying to play nuts. So they decided to go search for the bodies. And they found the bodies, photographed them. And Belgi decided that under the rules of law, without Garrow's permission, they couldn't tell authorities or the girl's parents where these bodies were. So now
all right. So hang on. So already in this incredible tale, from a lawyer's perspective, there are 2 very questionable things that the lawyers did. First of all, the one lawyer, Armani, hypnotized his own client and then didn't tell the lawyer he was working with that the client had been hypnotized.
Correct.
That seems very iffy to me. And then
Yes.
the other is probably will strike a lot of people not trained in the law as being very iffy, but and that's the attorney-client privilege, that when a client tells you something, you have to keep it in strict confidence unless the client agrees to waive the privilege. And so here they have this information about these other murders, and including so what the client has told them, they're keeping confidential, at least through this point in time.
Yes.
Well, what about the investigation the lawyers did themselves that's not necessarily a communication with their client? I mean, they went and it sounds like what you're describing is with their own hands and their own eyes, they verified the location of bodies of some of these victims.
Yes.
And they were also keeping that information from police and from the public and from the families.
Yes. And so we'll start up there. They go to verify his story, because that it's an incredible tale. Now they have this information and they have photographs of the bodies. And on the second one in Syracuse, the 16-year-old girl, she had been strangled and scavengers had gotten to her, and she had been strangled. The rope had been embedded so deeply into her neck that the scavenger just dragged her head about 10 feet away. And Belgi picked up her head and moved it back to the body for a photograph.
Oh my God.
This would later cause them a lot of problems. So anyways, they have this information, which is appalling. But let me place you in the shoes of the lawyers. They're both fathers of teenage girls. And Belgi had lost his youngest son in an automobile accident. He was 15 years old, 13 years old, a young teenager. And that had destroyed him and his wife and the family. It was, the youngest son, youngest child, it was a terrible thing. He knew the burden of losing a child as a parent. Armani had lost his brother in the service. And so they both knew the loss. Now they saw these bodies and they're sick. He really did kill these girls. You know, they were just, what do we do? And
horribly, brutal. Yeah.
Brutal finding. Belgium was well versed in criminal and constitutional law. And he told Armani, he says, you know, we can't say anything unless Garrow gives us permission. And their main reason for that was their oath of office in the New York bar. At the time, their oath of office said that I will uphold the Constitution of the state of New York and I will keep the secrets of my client inviolate. And they really believed in that oath. And then there was the Fifth Amendment, the self-incrimination. They would be, even if they gave this information over, they would be telling on their client, ratting on their client. And Armani still wasn't sure with this information that Belgium gave him. He still thinks maybe they should turn him in. So he seeks out a friend from his past, a Supreme Court judge, Frank Del Vecchio. He's now passed.
Another Frank. Every lawyer is a Frank in this store.
And yeah, they're all Italians. Frankie. And Del Vecchio, you know, he tells Del Vecchio basically the basics of the story. You know, if a client disclose something, can I tell? And he's like, no, you know, you're crazy. There's no question, whatever, constitutionally, you can't tell. And that's the big difference between what a good person would do and what a good lawyer would do. You know, obviously a good person would go to authorities and report it. And but now these guys are under oath to represent Garrow against New York State, who's trying to prosecute him. They had an adversarial position. So
now there, Jim, there are some exceptions to this inviolate duty to keep a client's confidential information, keep it confidential, but I don't think they really applied here, right? Because
at the time,
Garrow was in custody. He wasn't going to hurt anyone else at this point.
Right. At the time, it's the wording in the ABA model has changed since then. Now, because of this case, if a lawyer can prevent a person being killed or bodily harmed, they have an obligation to turn in their client. Now, that wasn't in the wording of the jurisdiction at the time, but they knew it was implied that, but these girls were already dead. So there was no saving them.
Right.
And
Garrow was in custody. So it's not.
Garrow was in custody.
He'd been on the loose. That probably would have been a very different situation for the lawyers. Right.
If he was going to commit to make it simple, if he was going to commit a future crime, they had an obligation to tell. The crimes were committed in the past. He was in custody and could not commit more crimes. Under their legal purity of the law, of what they read and understood, was they couldn't tell. And but as fathers, they needed to tell. They went through a terrible time. Mrs. Belgi, who's still alive today, Frank Belgi died quite a while ago. We'll get into that later. But Frank Belgi came home and cried every night in his bedroom. Mrs. Belgi had to keep the kids out of earshot, and she knew this was tearing him apart. And he had just recovered from his son's loss 4 years prior. He was just coming out of a funk. And he started drinking heavily at this time. And Armani was going through the same thing, sleepless nights. What do they do? And the lesson, one of the lessons here is they really weren't self-serving. They were the complete antithesis of self-serving. They took the road that would be more detrimental to them, to be honest with themselves, that this is the law that we read, that we can't turn our client in, even though it's going to hurt us terribly. And
Well, and that's what, that's what makes tough cases tough, because obviously there are very good reasons why there is an attorney-client privilege, why attorneys are obligated, except in certain exceptional circumstances, why an attorney is bound to keep the confidence of his or her client. There are good reasons for that. I mean, people, even those accused of horrible crimes, and much less than that, have a right to, get advice and representation from their lawyer, and they can't do that if they can't speak openly and speak confidentially to their lawyer. So the principle is an important one in our legal system. It's these tough cases that as you're describing it, this tough case was tearing these two lawyers apart morally, ethically, but there is a good sound reason for the principle in general. It's just in this tough case, it's so challenging and personal.
Yeah. So what the results is, this is probably one of the most controversial, attorney-client privilege cases. They do. They know they can't rationalize it to anyone, any parent, or why they were doing what they were doing.
Right.
They felt they needed to know all the facts of their client to give him a proper defense. And that was why they pushed him for so much information. They wanted full disclosure. They wanted no surprises when it came to trial. They want, and so now they have the burden of what to do with this info, and they feel under the law they can't give it away. So they, Mrs. Belgi, who the two wives knew, they were the others that knew, naturally in the house. Although lawyers never disclosed that, but both have said that. But Mrs. Belgi decided she wanted to write a letter, anonymous letter, and mail it out of state to the parents, telling them the location. And her husband, Frank Belgi, contemplated it, but he said ultimately it would be dishonest with himself because the information would still be deriving from Garrow. And so what they decided was, and this became a big controversy too, they decided they would go to the district attorney who's prosecuting Garrow for one murder. That's all they have evidence for, one murder, the 18-year-old camper, 2 weeks after the missing woman. And the head investigator of the state police, Henry McCabe, who I mentioned earlier, they decided to go to them and plea bargain. They will reveal cold cases and where bodies are if they can get a second-degree manslaughter charge, and Garrow can go into a mental home. And that's what Garrow wanted. And so they've had this meeting, and it lasts about 5 minutes. The prosecutor and the investigator tell them they're nuts, and if they have information on other cases, they'll be prosecuted. And it goes nowhere. And to this day, the two defense lawyers blame the prosecution and the state for not letting them reveal the bodies.
Right, because their argument is the prosecutor could have made a deal, and the prosecutor refused to make that deal.
Yes, and now you got to remember, the prosecutor at the time was the prosecutor of the least populous county in the state. That's where the murder occurred, Hamilton County, which is all, hunting, fishing territory. And it's a large county geographically, but it's the least populous in all of New York State. And, this guy really, to be honest, didn't really know the law that well. He was a local lawyer that lived there and got hired as district attorney, and, mostly speeding cases, drunken driving. And so now he has this big murder case, and they would later bring in a special prosecutor to help him, but at the time he didn't have one. So he refused the case. But the investigator, who was sharp, he also refused it. He thought they were out of their minds. He'd never heard such a thing. And he told me that in his whole life. He said, here you got two fathers of teenage girls, and they're keeping this secret. So anyways, that doesn't work out.
Right. Okay.
So they're back to the burden of the bodies. And the case goes to trial the next summer. And in the meantime, passersby find the bodies. Saturday, December 1st, about 3 months after the lawyers had found the bodies, 2 boys in Mineville find the girl in a mine shaft. And then a week later, a Syracuse University student finds the second girl. The lawyers say they know nothing about it to the press, and their client has nothing to do with it. And
wait, hold on a second.
Okay.
Now that to me raises, another challenging issue, because a lawyer also has a duty of candor, of being honest. You can't. How do they say their client had nothing to do with those when they knew that he did?
That was where, it gets into a gray area.
Yeah, I would say.
I guess I suppose they thought it would be self-incrimination again. If they said, because where the bodies were found were very close to, like Garrow's connections. Is one was behind his parents' house and one was behind his own home.
Right.
So they went as far as saying
there's
that,
also there's also a question, Jim, that passersby just happened to find these 2 bodies so close in time. Do you think that was a coincidence, or do you think something through some channel did leak out so that people were tipped off?
No, I actually, in the book, interview one of the boys that found the body. And it was just coincidental.
Okay. Wild.
I think one of the main reasons was vegetation had died down. It was now December, and the areas they were hidden in the summer were heavily vegetated. And
I see.
The first boys were just hiking, and that's an interesting story in the book that people would like to read. They actually found the body on Thanksgiving Day, and nobody believed them. And 8 days passed, and they finally convinced one of the mothers that they were telling the truth, and she finally called state police. But meanwhile, all the boys in town and girls were teenagers riding their bikes up to see the body.
Oh my God.
Because all the kids knew, and a teacher overheard it and a bus driver overheard it, but they didn't buy it. No one believed these kids. And so it was this kind of like this secret, this little gang of kids up in the Adirondacks going to see this body.
Wow.
It's not funny, but just crazy story. And then the second body was found by a Syracuse University student who was studying the habitat of squirrels, and just happened to be out in the park. Wow. And come across the bones. And so yeah, it was pure coincidence. And so anyways, it goes to trial the next year.
Right.
And this is where it gets crazy.
No, it's already where it gets crazier. And by the way, don't give away the whole book either, because I guarantee you people are going to want to read this book. I'm on the edge of my seat, but you want to keep me there a little bit.
So they go to trial.
Yeah.
Prosecutors only have evidence on one murder, enough evidence to bring to trial on one murder. Okay. The 18-year-old camper who was killed on that quiet Sunday morning on July 29th. And Mr. Garrow has a stellar reputation, even though he was an ex-convict from a 1961 rape in Albany, and he got 20 years prison time. And he was sent to Dannemora and then Auburn near Syracuse. And he became the state's model prisoner. He took over 3,000 hours of credits, college credits, and everything they offered. He studied theology. He was perfect. He did his 20 years in 6 2/3. He did less than 7 years because of his behavior. Wow. He became a model parolee. He moved to Syracuse, away from the city of Albany. He went to Syracuse because it was new hunting ground. He had, the reputation in Albany as this rapist, and he went to Syracuse, and he was a married father of 2 teenagers, a boy and a girl. And he lived this model life in Syracuse. His next door neighbor was a Syracuse police officer, and they were good friends. he had a great reputation at work. He was a millwright at the Millbrook Bakery, bread bakery, where he was supervisor and fixed all the machines for baking bread. It stellar reviews. But meanwhile, he was raping and killing people, but no one knew it. And so Armani decided to line up all these people, his parole officer, his neighbors, the police, people that could vouch for him. And then say he snapped in an insanity defense and killed this boy. And so he spent a good 9 months sending out subpoenas to these people. And on the day of the defense, the first day of the defense, Armani briefs the witnesses, and he comes into court, and Belge tells him they're going to take a different tactic, something he had never mentioned before. He's not calling any of the witnesses other than the psychiatrist, and he's going to put Garrow on the stand. And have him admit to the 4 murders and another 8 rapes, including the bodies they found, to prove insanity. And of course, this leads to a dispute right in the courtroom, and they take a recess. And Garrow says, "I want to do what Belge wants. I want to do that. Take the stand." And Armani pleads with him, "You're not prepared, And so, anyways, they call Mr. Garrow as their first witness, and Belge goes into about 20 minutes of his background, and the judge catches on that something's amiss, so he calls a recess. And none of this is in the trial transcripts, but a lot of it's never been told before till my book. But the judge realized that what Belge was going to do, he was going to have him admit not only to the murder he was being tried for, but for 3 other murders and a slew of rapes. And they have about a 20-minute recess, sidebar, and adjournment, really, and send a jury out. And so that the trial restarts, and the judge pleads with Garrow not to self-incriminate himself. And Garrow has a few basic questions, like, stupid questions, but will I be treated the same at the jail? Will the guards turn on me? And Martin says, no, but, we're pleading that, you have this Fifth Amendment right not to tell on yourself. You can't tell on yourself in the courtroom where, the court has to compel you not to tell on yourself, And he says, well, I'm living on borrowed time, meaning I think he was suicidal at the time. And so Belge gets him to admit all these crimes. And Armani objects a couple times to his own co-counsel. Wow. And so why Belge did this, we'll get into later, but we really don't know why. But in his defense, he gave the sympathetic story to the jury about that this guy was an abused child, and he grew up in this bizarre life, and he was a bizarre sexual life, homosexuality, bestiality. And they really, really built up sympathy for this guy, even though he admitted to that. It was a good defense and a bad defense. But anyways, that day after court, Armani attacked Belge back at their cottage. They got into a physical fight, and pretty bad one. And, Armani always downplayed it. He said in his book, he had written a book before mine, that he was mad at Belge for making the unilateral decision. But in my book, I question whether Belge was trying to exculpate himself and by having Garrow reveal the bodies, because that was their other option besides the plea bargain. If Garrow would admit to these to where these bodies were, it would excuse their behavior. They could say we were using it as an insanity defense.
Yeah, that's the thought that I've been tossing around as I've been listening to this. You talk about the trial. Was Belge? Maybe it was a good defense, but it sounds like it was a very good defense for his own conscience, and
right,
and how
right.
much that a part of it.
And he made a point after Garrow mentioned one of the bodies, Sue Petz. Belgie said on the record, "Is that the body I found?" And of course, Armani cringed in his seat and he hoped no one heard that. But a reporter picked it up. Mm. After the first day of trial, the reporter went up to him and he said, "You guys knew this all along?" And that's when the story broke and hit the media. Mm. And the headlines were unbelievable.
About the lawyers and what the lawyers had known all.
Yeah, that the lawyers had known all along, and that they actually tried to pawn the bodies for a lesser charge in a plea bargain.
Oh my God.
And that's when all bedlam broke loose. And into the Adirondacks come Newsweek, reporters from Newsweek, Time Magazine, New York Times, LA Times.
Now it's a national story.
Trial. Yeah. And the jury doesn't know what's going on. The jury just knows that the media is building and building. They're sequestered. Mm. And, they don't quite know the ethics of it. So now all these columnists are writing, ethics don't seem so ethical. Lawyers' ethics don't seem so ethical. And it was really a big thing. Newsweek ran a photo of the two lawyers, at the courthouse. So it became a national story. And it was parallel at the time. It was the summer of Watergate. Mm. Public was very dissatisfied, to say the least, with lawyers because of the Watergate scandal and the lawyers lying for Nixon. Right. The whole legal industry was under question, and even Belgie and Armani's peers, the head of the district attorneys in New York at the time, Robert Meehan, went public and said justice and morality weren't given first priority in this case, with them not disclosing this. And the district attorney in Syracuse and Onondaga County said, what they did was beyond any concept of humanity. And so now they were really uncomfortable with their position, because they thought, from a legal standpoint, from the advice they got from Del Vecchio, that mm-hmm. done the right thing. But now, and this began to tear at them. One of the parents, he asked for an investigation from the New York State Bar to investigate the lawyers, and so proceedings went on.
Well, I don't want you to give away any more of what happens, because I'm
okay.
Because I'm riveted, truly, and I have to hear what happens. But I want to read it in the book,
okay.
And I want people to read it in the book. And by the way, we're going to put a link in the description, so all people have to do is click the link, and it'll take them to where they can buy a copy of the book. And I mean, I don't want to cut off the conversation if
sure.
If there's a wrapping up kind of point here, but let's not give away any more of the story.
Okay.
Not that it's
Fair
in
enough.
any way spoiled it, because I mean,
right.
Right. You're an award-winning journalist, Jim, and we want to hear the story as you tell it fully in the book. I guess since we're, this is my chance to talk to you. I guess maybe we could wrap up in this way and say, and this story and now this book, which you've worked on for a number of years, it's been part of your life since you were 8 years old.
Yes.
Just share a little bit about your own feelings about the story and what it's the fact that it's been such a big part of your own life personally.
Yes, it's grown up where I grew up. The name Garrow was equivalent to the boogeyman. That's what we all thought of him. We didn't know much about him, except he was a bad man that scared all of us. And so anytime growing up, or into my early 20s, I would say, you remember the Garrow case, and of course everybody does, or people will reflect a minute and remember it. So it was always there. And then when I was at the Post-Star, Pulitzer Prize winning newspaper on the foothills of the Adirondacks in Glens Falls, New York, I think the 25th anniversary of his capture was coming up. And it was a story that the paper had covered heavily. All the papers covered it. But I decided to I asked the police reporter if he wanted to write about it, and he wasn't interested. So one of the editors said, "Why don't you write about it? You know it." And so I write about it, and then it hung with me. Particularly the case of Sue Petz, her and her boyfriend, who had the brightest futures in the world. He had worked for McGovern, and she was going to graduate with high honors from Boston U as a reporter herself. And they went to the Adirondacks for a one-night camping trip, and they're captured by this woodsman, and the boyfriend's killed, and she's taken up to Mineville, which is the High Peaks region of the Adirondacks, and held for 3 days in a tent. And it's like a story out of a horror movie. And so that was the one that stuck with me. And so anyways, I knew there was more to the story than what's come out. There's been 2 books prior to mine. One was Armani's, which was his own spin on the narrative, which is gone into the record. And then the second book was based on newspaper clippings, which we call the first draft of history. There's always errors, and because you're on deadline and police miscommunications. So I went and brought this whole thing to life using 4 main characters: Garrow, the 2 lawyers, and the investigator. The case today is important because it's taught in all law schools, as the standard for attorney-client privilege. After the case, these guys were ostracized. Belgie drank himself to death. Armani's law practice was ruined. He had several heart attacks. It broke him. And Armani told me, he says, I'm paraphrasing, but he says, "I don't chicken out. I was raised tough." He said, "But this case cracked me." He said, "I didn't enjoy life after it. I didn't enjoy my family after it. I guess, it wasn't meant to hurt innocent people, but I was raised with the idea that you do your duty." And as time went on, and law professors started looking at this, they started holding it up as the almost heroic stance for the defense of a client. The fact that these 2 lawyers would go to this extreme to defend someone. And so after my newspaper series in 2000, Armani started taking tours of law schools and speaking on it. And all of a sudden, a bunch of awards started pouring in. Syracuse University hands out an award in his name, the Frank Armani Advocacy Award, for his defense of Garrow.
Wow.
It was too many honors to name. And so now they're kind of seen as heroes in the legal world. And so it's an important story taught in law schools today. And it takes, dry ethical theory and gives you a real life example. Students are fascinated with it. And I felt that for the record, that the whole truth should be told. Incredible. So I got the records from the Criminal Bureau of Investigation. I got the trial transcripts, which were something like 2,000 pages. And I interviewed a lot of the victims and a lot of the investigators, and got the story and wrote my version of the story as factually as I could. I changed no names, changed no details. So hopefully it goes on the record to give people a little better perspective of what the attorneys did, because certainly it looked shady. It's turned out to be they're heroic in theory, but the steps they took, are questionable. I'm not an attorney, of course, but it's still a case that makes you think.
It's so interesting, the twists and turns and how it affected their lives personally, professionally, and then kind of this resurrection later in life for Armani. It seems to me pretty darn gray. And but that's what makes it a great story, actually. And so and what an incredible story. I'm so grateful to you, Jim, for sharing it with us. And I'm going to hang up from this call, and I'm going to order my copy. I already have a digital copy, but I like to support authors, so I want to buy a copy of the book. I encourage everybody to, if you found this conversation as riveting as I did, and how could you not? Please get a copy of Jim Tracy's book, Sworn to Silence, The Truth Behind Robert Garrow and the Missing Bodies Case. We'll put a link in the description for the episode again so people can get it easily. And thank you so much, Jim. It was such a great pleasure to meet you and talk with you today about the book.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you for having me.